So how do we learn? And why do some of us learn things more easily than others? We used to think that after childhood, the brain really could not change. And it turns out that nothing could be farther from the truth. Another misconception about the brain is that you only use parts of it at any given time and it's silent when you do nothing. Well, this is also untrue. It turns out that even when you're at rest and thinking of nothing, your brain is highly active. So it's been advances in technology, such as MRI, that's allowed us to make these and many other important discoveries. And perhaps the most exciting, the most interesting and transformative of these discoveries is that every time you learn a new fact or skill, you change your brain. It's something we call neuroplasticity. So what does it look like? So your brain can change in three very basic ways to support learning. And the first is chemical. So your brain actually functions by transferring chemical signals between brain cells, what we call neurons, and these trigger a series of actions and reactions. So to support learning, your brain can increase the amount or the concentrations of these chemical signaling that's taking place between neurons. Now, because this kind of change can happen very rapidly, this supports short-term memory, or the short-term improvement in the performance of a motor skill. The second way that the brain can change to support learning is by altering its structure. So during learning, the brain can change the connections between neurons. Now here, the physical structure of the brain is actually changing, so this takes a bit more time. These types of changes are related to long-term memory, the long-term improvement in a motor skill. Remember that long-term memories take time, and what you see in the short term does not reflect learning. It's these physical changes that are now going to support long-term memories and chemical changes that support short-term memories. Structural changes also can lead to integrated networks of brain regions that function together to support learning. And they can also lead to certain brain regions that are important for very specific behaviors to change their structure or to enlarge. And so here's some examples of that. So people who read Braille, they have larger hand sensory areas in their brain than those of us who don't. Your dominant hand motor region, which is on the left side of your brain if you're right-handed, is larger than the other side. And research shows that London taxicab drivers who actually have to memorize a map of London to get their taxicab license, they have larger brain regions devoted to spatial or mapping memories. Now, the last way that your brain can change to support learning is by altering its function. As you use a brain region, it becomes more and more excitable and easy to use again. And as your brain has these areas that increase their excitability, the brain shifts how and when they're activated. With learning, we see that whole networks of brain activity are shifting and changing. So neuroplasticity is supported by chemical, by structural, and by functional changes. And these are happening across the whole brain. They can occur in isolation from one another, but most often they take place in concert. Together, they support learning, and they're taking place all the time. So I've just told you really how awesomely neuroplastic your brain is. So why can't you learn anything you choose to with ease? Why do our kids sometimes fail in school? Why, as we age, do we tend to forget things? And why don't people fully recover from brain damage? That is, what is it that limits and facilitates neuroplasticity? So the first lesson is that the primary driver of change in your brain is your behavior. So there's no neuroplasticity drug you can take. Nothing is more effective than practice at helping you learn. And the bottom line is, you have to do the work. And in fact, my research has shown that increased difficulty, increased struggle, if you will, during practice actually leads to both more learning and greater structural change in the brain. The second lesson we've learned about the brain is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to learning. So there's no recipe for learning. Consider the popular belief that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to learn and to master a new motor skill. Now, I can assure you, it is not quite that simple. For some of us, it's going to take a lot more practice, and for others, it may take far less. So the shaping of our plastic brains it's far too unique for there to be any single intervention that's going to work for all of us. And now this realization have forced us to consider something called personalized medicine. And I believe we have to consider not just personalized medicine, but personalized learning. The uniqueness of your brain will affect you, both as a learner and also as a teacher. And now this idea helps us to understand why some children can thrive in traditional education settings and others don't, why some of us can learn languages easily, and yet others can pick up any sport and excel. So when you leave this room today, your brain will not be the same as when you entered this morning. But each of you is going to have changed your brain differently. Study how and what you learn best. Repeat those behaviors that are healthy for your brain, and break those behaviors and habits that are not. Practice. Learning is about doing the work that your brain requires. So the best strategies are going to vary between individuals. You know what? They're even going to vary within individuals. So for you, learning music may come very easily, but learning to snowboard, much harder. Understand that everything you do, everything you encounter, and everything you experience is changing your brain. And that can be for better, but it can also be for worse. So when you leave today, go out and build the brain you want.
I'm angry because I wish I knew this when I was younger. So I'm a neuroscientist and a lecturer. And as a neuroscientist, I study the brain and the nerves that span out into the body. And as a lecturer, I teach the next generation of healthcare professionals. And look, I see some students struggle with their learning, especially the older ones, but it's not their fault. You know, we don't get taught how to learn. We just kind of expect it to happen. And I think the worst curse of all really is it gets harder to learn as we age. But what if I told you that there are things that we can do to learn faster and more effectively? I'm going to take you through the neuroscience behind 6 critical ingredients that can help you learn faster: attention, alertness, sleep, repetition, breaks, and mistakes. Now, first things first, well, how do we actually learn? We need neuroplasticity to happen. So neuroplasticity is the scientific term that essentially means our brain's ability to physically change in response to experience. So when we're learning something, whether it's learning information or learning a skill, tiny little connections called synapses form between neighbouring neurons in the brain. And the more we do that thing, whether it's information or a skill, the more robust those connections become and the better we get at doing whatever it is. Now, what you're looking at here are 2 neurons that I filmed in a petri dish connecting. Actually, this was a petri dish that I was about to throw away, but I could see that they're about to connect, so I quickly took this video. Now, these incredible hand-like structures here are called growth cones, and every neuron has one. They actively sense the environment around, and they help each and every one of the 86 billion neurons in your brain find the correct place to connect to. So, for example, from here to here or here to here. And this isn't learning. This doesn't represent learning. What it represents is how our brain wires itself during development. Now, when things go wrong with that wiring process, or when it doesn't happen in the usual way, you can end up with things like issues with learning and memory. Now, kids are a little bit like sponges, right? You know, they just seem to need to be exposed to stuff and they seem to remember it. Languages, skills, sports, whatever it is, the learning just happens really quickly. Now, have you ever met someone who's incredibly talented and you just thought, okay, they must have some magic thing about them that the rest of us don't have? Well, what if I told you that that's probably not true? It mostly comes down to practice, perseverance, and when in development they started learning that skill. So the earlier, the better. And people like Serena Williams and Beethoven, they weren't born with their skills. They practiced, and they all actually started by age 5. So really our ability to learn kind of goes downhill after age 5. But it certainly gets harder through our childhood, through our teens, and once we hit our mid-20s, it gets exponentially harder to learn. But the good news is I'm going to tell you what you can actually do about it. So first things first, in order to learn, well, we need to pay attention, right? Attention's a really important function. And what that means is that we have the ability to choose how much attention we pay to something. And studies have shown that when we are fully focused on a task, we are much more likely to retain that information, especially for the long term. We're designed to focus on one thing at a time. There's no secret that the frequent context switching that happens when we use social media, so scrolling through our phones and seeing lots of different bits of completely unrelated bits of information like news, ads, cat videos, that results in significantly measurable attention deficits. So I'm not saying it causes ADHD, but studies have shown that if you use your phone for more than an hour in teens, that results in these attention deficits. Now, if you wanted to improve your attention in the long term, there are things like focused attention meditation that you can do to improve that. And if you wanted to improve your attention in the really short term, well, you can actually just exercise. Did you know that exercise can actually increase the size of the part of your brain involved in learning and memory? It also helps you make new brain cells. And studies have shown that regular exercise improves memory, it improves cognition, so your ability to think, and just 20 minutes of moderate exercise, so not even, intense exercise, that will actually improve your attention for about 2 hours afterwards. Next, we have alertness. In order to learn, you've got to be alert. If you're not fully focused on a task, then you're going to have a harder time retaining that information. Activating our body's fight or flight system, or activating our sympathetic nervous system, as it's also known, results in the release of things like adrenaline and noradrenaline. And amongst other things, that will increase our alertness. So what are some other things that we can do to increase our fight or flight system? Again, exercise, bit of a recurring theme here. You can do certain breathing techniques like Wim Hof breathing. You can even end your shower with a bit of a cold blast of water because that will certainly make you feel very alert. And we also know that stress will do the same thing. So we know that if you sit down to learn after a small stressor, that will enhance your learning. You can have too much stress though. So if you have been experiencing stress for a long period of time, you will have impairments in memory. It is that simple. So do be kind to yourself. But little bits of stress are good. They actually help you reach peak performance. And we know that having a little bit of a increase in adrenaline after a learning task will actually enhance your learning as well. Now, you can also ingest substances to enhance your alertness, things like caffeine. And there's a growing body of evidence now that shows that having caffeine before a learning task, or actually just being a regular caffeine drinker, can enhance your learning and memory through a range of different mechanisms in the brain. If you eat, you are less alert because that's switching off our fight or flight system. So maybe don't sit down to study after a big meal. There's also a limit to our alertness as well. So it's still a little bit contentious, but studies have shown that we are constantly going through what we call an ultradian rhythm. So about every 90 minutes, we're going in and out of peak alertness. So the reality is you can't be 100% alert all the time. And it's going to be a chunk of about 8 to 30 minutes in the middle there where you'll be most alert. Now, another thing for alertness is sleep. Yes, if you haven't been sleeping, then yes, you won't be as alert. But sleep is really important for learning for another reason. So sleep serves a really important constellation of functions. So for example, it resets our immune system, it resets our metabolism, it resets our emotional control, and it even gets rid of the waste that builds up in our brain over the course of the day. But sleep is actually critical for memory consolidation. So for turning short-term memories into long-term memories. Now, there's a particular part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is really important for learning and memory. So when you do stuff throughout the course of the day, your hippocampus is really keeping track of that. It's a bit like a diary. So if I was to ask you what you were doing before you sat down to listen to this talk, you're using your hippocampus to recall that information. But it only keeps information there for the short term. And when you sleep, all of those short-term memories get flitted off to other parts of the brain, the cortex, and turned into long-term memories. So if you don't sleep, you can't turn those short-term memories into long-term memories. And that's why sleep is so important for learning. That's why pulling an all-nighter and cramming is kind of the worst thing you can do for study, because you are not going to retain that information for the long term. So really, here's what you should do. If you're, make sure you prioritize your sleep before you study, just so you can be a bit more alert, but also really prioritize that study after learning, because you will need that to retain that information for the long term. Now, the old adage says that practice makes perfect, but there's so much truth to that, because repetition is key when it comes to learning. It's not enough to just hear or see something once and expect to remember it forever. Just like exercising builds muscle, repetitive patterns of thinking or doing things will reinforce those pathways and those connections in the brain associated with doing that thing. So it'll become easier to recall. So through the process of neuroplasticity, you're making these brand new connections, right? And that takes energy, requires fatty acids, requires lots of little proteins to be made. It's a big job. It takes a lot of energy. And the brain's not going to want to invest all of this energy in creating these new connections if it's something that you've only done once, right? That is why repetition is so important for learning. It's basically flagging to your brain at the cellular level that, hey, this is the thing that keeps coming up in my life. So in order to be more efficient, I need to reinforce this and do it better. So here's what you should do. Repeat the thing that you are trying to learn as many times as you can in that learning period, and use the spacing technique. So space your learning out over multiple days. So that way your learning has a chance to build on those new long-term memories. We know that 2 shorter learning periods over different days will result in significantly better learning than using that same amount of time on a single day. Sometimes we can learn things in one go, and this is a thing called one-trial learning in psychology and neuroscience. And it basically happens when there's a really strong emotional component tied to that experience. So, for example, if it makes us really happy or really sad or scared, especially if it makes us afraid, actually. And there's a really important biological reason for that if you think about it. So your brain wants to remember in exquisite detail everything to do with that scary event, so that way you know how to respond next time you encounter it, or just so you can avoid it completely. And when things go wrong with that process, well, you can end up with things like PTSD. Breaks are incredibly important for learning as well. And there are 2 main reasons for that. So first of all, it gives our brains a chance to replay that information. It happens completely subconsciously. So for example, if you were learning a sequence on the piano, then if you were to take a 10-second break afterwards, your brain will actually be, brain recordings show that you'll be replaying that sequence and you'll be doing it 20 times faster. And it looks like it might be even better if you spend 10 to 20 minutes afterwards, either just having a quiet break, no phones, of course, having a nap, or doing a round of non-sleep deep rest. Now, the other reason why breaks are important is because that newly encoded information isn't very stable. And if you were to use those same networks to learn something else very soon afterwards, what will happen is those newly encoded information can be destroyed in a process called retrograde interference. And in kids, they stabilize pretty quickly within a few minutes, but in adults, as far as we know, they're still unstable after an hour, maybe longer. So here's what you should do. Make sure you take a 10 to 20 minute break after you finish learning. And if you're at work, well, then just try and do those mundane tasks that you can do without thinking too much. And wait at least an hour before trying to learn something similar. Preferably do it on a different day. Next, we have mistakes. And I know making mistakes is terrifying. It is really scary. But there's a biological reason behind that. So that feeling of anxiety and stress you get when you make a mistake serves a really important purpose. So when you make a mistake, what happens is you're releasing neuromodulators like acetylcholine, and you're getting increased activity in your focused attention networks. And that increase in attention and that feeling of anxiety serves a really important purpose. It's basically saying to us, hey, you made a mistake, you need to change and do better and become more efficient. And it's opening up this window for neuroplasticity. So whatever happens next, your brain is ready to take in. Now, if you make a mistake and you feel a bit anxious and you walk away, well, A, you're not going to learn that thing, and B, well, you're actually learning to be less able to cope with failure. So here's what you should do. You should set yourself up for a little bit of failure, right? Quiz yourself on that topic as you go. Don't wait until you're ready. If you're learning something, so for example, soccer, don't just, kick it straight at the goal. Change the angle, make it more difficult so you make mistakes. Don't wait for everything to be perfect before you have a go. Because at the end of the day, if you make a mistake, you'll be releasing neuromodulators that improve your attention. And if you get it right, you'll be releasing things like dopamine in your reward circuits, which makes you feel good, which makes you feel more motivated, and consolidates the learning of the thing that you just did correctly, right? So that's why turning our learning into a bit of a game can work so well. It's a bit of a win-win situation for our brain either way, right? So when you make a mistake, don't view that anxiety as a bad thing. Lean into that feeling and keep going, because it's really your brain's way of helping you be your best. It's helping you be better than the person that you were yesterday.
What it takes to focus in a world of distraction. How does technology influence our attention and our ability to focus? I want to start with the attention spans that we have. This is how we pay attention to the world around us and how much control we have over our focus. It turns out that when we do work in front of a computer, especially when our phone is nearby, we focus on one thing for just 40 seconds before we switch to doing something else. But the reason that this is the case is not what we might think after looking at the research. We think the problem is that our brains are distracted. But after looking at the research, this is what I've come to know as a symptom for the deeper problem, which runs much more deeply. It's the root cause of this distraction. It's not that we're distracted, it's that our brains are overstimulated. It's that we crave distraction in the first place. Our brains love these tiny little nuggets of information and social media and email and these things that we do over the course of the day. There's even a mechanism in our mind called the novelty bias, by which our mind rewards us with a hit of dopamine, one of those wonderful pleasure chemicals, the same one that we get when we eat and order a whole medium pizza from Domino's, the same one that we get when we make love. We get that same stimulation when we check Facebook. We get this dopamine coursing through our mind, and so we not only crave distraction, but our mind rewards us for seeking out and finding distraction in the first place. What if I lowered how stimulated I was even more still? This feeling that we experience when we go from being in a state of high stimulation into a state of low stimulation, it has a name. That name is called boredom. It took about a week for my mind to adjust downward into a newer, lower level of stimulation. And this maps curiously on top of research that shows that it takes our mind about 8 days to fully calm down and rest, like when we're on vacation as an example. But I also noticed that my attention span expanded. I was able to focus even more effortlessly because I wasn't surrounded by fewer distractions, but my mind was so much less stimulated that it did not seek the distraction in the first place. But the fun part were these ideas and plans that struck me that didn't before. And the reason that this is the case is because my mind had a chance to wander more often. There's a great quote that I love that you might be familiar with from J.R.R. Tolkien, where he says that not all those who wander are lost. And the exact same thing is true, it turns out, with regard to our focus, with regard to our attention. If you think back to when your best, most brilliant ideas strike you, you're rarely focused on something. Maybe this morning you were taking a shower, or maybe some morning in the past, and then your mind had a chance to connect several of the constellations of ideas that were swirling around in your mind to create an idea that would never have materialized otherwise if you were focused on something else, on your phone, for example. This is a mode, especially when we do this deliberately, when we deliberately let our mind wander. I call this mode scatter focus. And the research shows that it lets our mind come up with ideas. It lets our mind plan because of where our mind wanders to. This is fascinating. It turns out that when we just let our attention rest, it goes to three main places. We think about the past, we think about the present, and we think about the future. But we think about the past less than we might think. Only about 12% of the time, and often the time we're recalling ideas in these thought-wandering episodes. But the present, which is a much more productive place to wander, we wander to think about the present 28% of the time. But here's the thing. Our minds wander to think about the future more than the past and the present combined. Whenever our mind is wandering, we think about the future 48% of the time. This is why when we're taking a shower, we plan out our entire day, even though it hasn't started yet. This is called our mind's prospective bias, and it occurs when our mind wanders. These numbers don't add up to 100. It's because the rest of the time our mind is dull, it's blank, or it doesn't have an idea inside of it that is rooted in time. But whatever it is for you that lets your mind wander, something that's simple, something that doesn't consume your full attention, whatever it is for you, it might be taking that extra long shower, it might be taking a bath, it could be simple. If you're at work, walking from one room to another in the office. Very simple change, but if you don't use your phone during that walk, your mind will go to the meeting that you're about to attend. It'll go to the call that you were just on. It'll wander to the ideas that are circulating, and it'll make you more creative in this way. It could be something as simple as waiting in line and just, waiting in line. Here's a pro tip. Have a notepad in the session, because ideas always come to you and you're always incubating things, and so capture them so you can act upon them later. But I think after doing this deep dive into the research, we need to make two fundamental shifts with regard to how we think about our attention. We think that we need to fit more in. There's all this talk about hustling. I'm an anti-hustler. I'm one of the laziest people you'll ever meet, and I think that's what gives me so many ideas to talk and write about. We don't need to fit more in. We're doing enough. We're doing too much. We're doing so much that our mind never wanders anymore. It's sad. This is when our best ideas and plans come to us. We need more space. The second shift. We like to think of distraction as the enemy of focus. It is not. It is a symptom of why we find it difficult to focus, which is the fact that our mind is overstimulated. Have a disconnection ritual every evening. One of my favorite daily rituals, I disconnect from the internet completely from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. Disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with the physical world, the real, actual world. Rediscover boredom just for a few minutes. Lay on the couch, and where does your mind go? And scatter your attention. If there's one thing that I have found to be true after doing this deep dive into this world on how we focus, it's that the state of our attention is what determines the state of our lives. If we're distracted in each moment, those moments of distraction and overstimulation build up and accumulate to create a life that feels more distracted and overwhelming, like we don't have a clear direction. But when we become less stimulated, when we make our mind more calm, we get the benefits of added productivity and focus and ideas and creativity, but we also live a better life because of it.